Right. My name is Rich Schmidt. I'm here with Ben Casteel. We're at Bethel Heights, or at least near Bethel Heights. It's May 12th, 2021. Thank you so much for joining us today, Ben.
It's my pleasure.
This. First question for you is, why wine?
Well, I guess there's probably two parts to that. I mean, I think the easy one, as we're sitting here on my Aunt Pat's porch, is we're right in the middle of Bethel Heights, is I was born into it. My parents moved here from Seattle, Washington when I was less than 1 year old and purchased a baby vineyard, a tiny little property. The west side had been planted. The east side hadn't. They were joined by my aunt and my uncle in 1978. And I grew up around it basically my whole life. I wonder a lot of times if I would have found my way to wine. It certainly wasn't my ambition early in life. It's not what I went to school for. I was an English major. I grew up working in the vineyard. We were, my cousins and my brother and I were sort of indentured labor. It was just sort of assumed that we would be working out in the vineyard, whether we wanted to or not. So I grew up in the vineyard quite a bit, not so much the winery, because we were always in school during harvest, and because we make varieties that don't require a lot of early bottling, there really wasn't much going on. Mm-hmm. So most of the work was mainly outside, which I enjoyed, but it's not really what I wanted in higher education. But then I somehow found my way back. I mean, I took French in college for no particular reason, so it had to at least have been dawned on me that I wanted to go to France someday. I ended up going to France after college to work in a winery because as an English major, of course, I had no practical skills to offer the world. So I wanted to go and do what I knew. And I knew a little bit about working in wineries. I knew a little bit about working in vineyards. I went to Burgundy and I loved it. I came back still with my intention to go on to graduate school, get a master's and eventually a PhD in English literature and teach. But I still needed a job, so I ended up working at with Lynn Penerash at Rex Hill, and I think having the whole immersive experience of seeing harvest through the growing season to harvest to then the élevage of the wines. I guess I'd never really thought about it as a whole cycle. Mm-hmm. I'd only ever seen it in little chunks. I'd also only ever really seen it as my dad's job, my dad and my uncle and my aunt and my mother's job. Mm-hmm. And I think the outside perspective is sort of what ended up pulling me back in. I think that's one side to the question. I mean, if that were it, then there's a question of whether I did it and then would I want to go off and do something else. And I think the nice thing about wine is the unknowable part of it. Is it's a growing season, and in Oregon we have all different kinds of growing seasons, all shapes and sizes. The vineyard, the boring nuts and bolts of terroir, that it's geology, geography, topography, climatology, ampelography, what you've decided to plant and where, of course plays a part, but it's not an equation that adds up to a wine tasting like X, Y, or Z. And that's even before I've gotten my grubby little hands all over it and done the the wine making piece of it. Mm-hmm. It's ineffable. It's something you can never truly know. I would argue it's something you can never truly master. Mm-hmm. And for me, I love that. I mean, I don't think I would ever want to be in a discipline where you can sort of just figure it out. Mm-hmm. That like the physicists, when they discovered the Higgs boson particle, like there was like this general ennui in their whole field because it's like, oh well, we found it. We've been looking for it and we found it, and now what do we do? So I that's what keeps me coming back. I mean, it's frustrating. I mean, the vintage, of course, can take all of your best laid plans and lay them to waste. But to me, that's what I love about the wine industry.
So you mentioned growing up in it and the kind of indentured servitude of it. We've obviously talked to a lot of people in the sort of second generation of the founding families around here. A lot of similar stories of growing up in it, not really appreciating it and kind of wanting to get away from it. So tell me about some of your memories of working in it growing up and what, at the time, what made you think this wasn't what you wanted to do necessarily?
Well, I think this applies to the vineyard, it applies to the winery. I mean, in terms of the work, a lot of it is very repetitive. I mean, our vineyard is old. The oldest vines here are 43 years old. A big chunk on the other side of of the ravine are 41. So they're widely spaced. I mean, we're not set up to mechanize here, even if we wanted to. I mean, we're the island of antiquated trellis systems. I mean, it's all spacings. You can find it all here somewhere. So everything is done by hand. You know, you address every plant, you know, between 11 and 13 times a year. And explaining why that's important to a 13-year-old can be challenging, like why this needs to be done the right way over and over and over again without cutting any corners. I found it endlessly frustrating when I was a kid. It was boring. You know, your mind starts to wander, and then you're not paying attention to what you're doing. And then your uncle tells you to pay more attention to what you're doing, and you get resentful. So, you know, it was great. I got to grow up with my cousins and my brother. We were all out there together. So it was fun. I mean, I enjoy all of their company very much. I did then, I do now. So, you know, it was fun, but it was, you know, summertime in Oregon, it's hot. You can tell Oregonians, you can pick them out easy because they'll start complaining about the weather when it, you know, eclipses like 78 degrees Fahrenheit. It's like, does anybody else think it's really hot? So yeah, I mean, that's my memory of it. I will share, as you said, with my peers, you don't appreciate it. I didn't appreciate it nearly enough, and I feel guilty about that all the time. I remember we were driving with my aunt's sister, Barbara, up to Mount Rainier, as my cousin Mimi and I, a long time ago. And, you know, there's Mount Rainier sort of just appears as you're driving north towards it. I mean, and we were just like, you know. And my aunt, Barbara, who at the time I think was still living in New York, is like, you guys just don't, I mean, you just see stuff like this all the time. You don't appreciate it. And it's true. You know, I look at the property now and I feel lucky. That's the only real word I can use. But growing up in it, I guess I just couldn't see it yet. I think I didn't have enough perspective.
So tell me about, from your perspective at that time, what did the industry look like to you? Was there anything beyond Bethel Heights in the industry to you? Did you have any other connections outside of the area?
Occasionally. I mean, we're sort of isolated down here in the Eola Amity Hills. I mean, you know, early on, you know, there was Amity with Meyer and Redford. But there wasn't a whole lot here. And so if we were going somewhere, we were driving north. I remember, you know, we hung out with Harry Peterson Nedry from Chehalem, because his son Ian and I were basically the same age. So we'd go over there for dinner on occasion. We'd go to the Ponzi's for 4th of July on occasion. David Adelsheim would occasionally throw a party, but I didn't really feel connected to it. I mean, it's always funny when I'm hanging out with like Alex Sokol-Blosser or Jason Lett or Louisa Ponzi or Adam Campbell. I think people always assume that we like all chummed around as kids, and it's not really true. I didn't really get to know them until they were all adults.
So you mentioned that your thought was to go and do English literature and take it all the way into academia. Where did that come from, and at what point did you decide that was the path you wanted to take? Well, I mean, my whole family was in academia for a long time. My dad and my uncle, between them, have many different degrees. I mean, it almost looks like, you know, sort of a chronic, I don't want to know what I want to do with my life, so I'm just going to keep getting another degree in college. And so, you know, I think reading was fostered in me pretty early. I've always loved to read. I've always been more of a fiction guy than a nonfiction guy. You know, I like stories as they speak to the human condition, because to me, you know, it's something we can all understand and relate to, but not necessarily in a literal way. I loved that, and I always have. And I mean, I was a declared English major going in as a freshman in college. I had no doubt in my mind what I wanted to do. You know, I've come to appreciate the sciences. I just wasn't ever really any good at them. I had to memorize mathematics. It didn't come to me like sort of figuring it out. No, I had to like memorize what I was doing. Same thing with chemistry. I of course appreciate them much more now as an adult, but I hated them when I was a kid. Whereas, you know, interpreting a poem or a piece of fiction, that wasn't hard work for me. Whether I was right or wrong is a completely different matter, but at least I thought it was easy for me. I felt confident in doing it. I remember Ron Kaplan, who used to be the owner of Panther Creek. We were talking about school, and I was griping about something or other. I can't remember. But he asked me what my major was, and I was like, English. He's like, oh, what are you complaining about? I mean, you know, it's not like, you know, you lie in bed and read A Light in August by William Faulkner. It's not like I'm twisting your arm and making you memorize the periodic table or something like that. And that was a good comment for me to hear at that time. It was like, no, I mean, I literally like what I'm studying. I enjoy
my classes. I enjoy what I'm doing once we got beyond, the sort of basic curriculum that everybody has to take. And I like school. I mean, I like structure. I really liked a couple of my teachers, and they had sort of pushed me to maybe pursue something further in academia. I like communicating with people. One of my favorite things, during harvest is bringing in young people who don't really know all of this yet. They've got some opinions formed, but whether it's sommeliers or people who have gone through the UC Davis program, I like that sort of youthful energy that they bring. And for me, teaching, that would always be a way to sort of stay connected to that. At the time I was 21 years old. I wasn't thinking about aging and then, needing to relate to young people. That's sort of come to me later in life, but that wasn't one of my intentions when I was, just graduating. But, I liked that idea of being in that for, as a career.
So you talked about going to Burgundy. What prompted you to go to Burgundy to work a harvest?
Well, I wanted to travel. I'd never been out of North America. I mean, I'd been to Canada and I'd been to Mexico. And I'd never been to Europe. And of course, as an English major, you read about Western Europe constantly. So I wanted to go. I spoke enough French to tell you, what articles of clothing I'm currently wearing and ask a couple of basic directions, and that was it. So I think it was a little naive for me to assume that I could just go over there and work a harvest, but that's what happened. I worked for Nadine Gobelin. She was the winemaker who was overseeing, a bunch of different places. I mean, it was under a big umbrella, at least early on. But I worked at Domaine de Perdrix for the most part in Primo-Prissé, which is right outside of Nuit-Saint-Georges. People, I think, always assume that when you go work a harvest in Burgundy, you're somehow indoctrinated with all of this new information that you maybe didn't have, and I found that to be the exact opposite of my experience. You go to a different country, it's still tanks and pumps and hoses and vines. I mean, everything's laid out a little bit differently, but we were processing grapes, we were doing cap management, we were shoveling out tanks. I mean, it was just, it's labor. And I think I was in such culture shock that I didn't even really think to start asking meaningful questions about how I could, maybe someday get better at this if this was in fact my job. Mainly because I was having trouble understanding anybody. When I worked, in Paris, I mean, eventually everybody will speak English too. I mean, Nadine took me to her, I think it was like her women's group, just because she didn't know what to do with me right when I'd landed. And so I'm sitting there with all of these, very affluent, probably mid-60s women in their women's group, and I was trying to speak to everybody I could, but I was still so nervous about my French, I wasn't really trying. I was speaking in English, and nobody would really talk to me until they all had like 3 or 4 glasses of wine, in which I realized that everybody, in fact, spoke perfect British English. And that was sort of my experience throughout. But I loved being in France. Like I said, looking back at it, I wish I would have asked a million more questions to Robert, the directing winemaker at Domaine de Perdrix when I was there. But I was just asking so many questions about so many other things just because it was so new to me. I mean, I'd never seen buildings that old. I'd never seen, even just rock walls that were that old. So it was great perspective. And it was the first time, I think, I was on a plane ride back, and I think after any exhilarating trip, you sort of begin evaluating everything, and you're like, oh, I'm going to do this, and I'm going to do this. Whether you actually get to them is a whole different matter. But, I was still applying to graduate school. I was still, sort of laying out, do I want to maybe try to write a book, or maybe just something short just to try it out and see. I was really excited. But there was also a bug that had sort of stuck around that I was like, well, what if I, maybe just go see this through for a whole year. I mean, I was in Burgundy for about 6 months, but there was a part of me that wanted to see the whole thing from grapes to the bottle. And so I was lucky enough that Lynn Penerash was hiring. Lynn and my dad and my uncle were and are still really good friends. And they had a position. It wasn't the one I wanted. It was in their warehouse. But at that point, I was like, you know what? I'll just get my foot in the door and work hard and hopefully managed to work my way up, and I was lucky enough that worked out. So I was at Rex Hill for 5 years. As I mentioned, I started just as their warehouse manager, and then eventually worked my way up to cellar master and then to assistant winemaker, and that was sort of transitioning from Lynn to the late and very good friend of mine, Aaron Hess, who I worked under for a couple of years, and then back home. just the way I planned it.
Just the way you planned it. Did you ever write that book?
No.
Tell me about your experience there. Now you haven't seen the whole really cycle yet. Now you're thinking, okay, I want to see the whole year of wine. Tell me about that experience at Rex Hill and what made you want to stay.
Well, it was sort of a dizzying experience. I mean, I got to admit. I mean, Rex Hill at the time was maybe 20,000 cases of wine. We weren't a big team. It was Lynn, Aaron was the enologist at the time, Doug Volstek was the cellar master, and me. And so, I mean, I got thrown right into it. I mean, yeah, I was moving pallets around with a forklift and stacking things up and driving their giant United diesel truck back and forth to the Abbey. But I got to work pretty quickly in with Doug in the cellar. Aaron was nice enough to train me up in the lab. And Lynn taught me how to taste wine. I mean, I haven't even gotten to that point yet that, I mean, at the time, I appreciated wine, but I couldn't really tell you much about it. Mm-hmm. I knew what I had sort of learned through hearing it my whole life. I mean, I knew these varieties are different than these varieties. I had the basic concept of how the thing was made. But in terms of sort of wine criticism, I hadn't even really thought about that. Mm-hmm. I knew what it smelled like to me, and that's something I will hold to this day is always the most important. I think the lexicon around wine is what unfortunately shrouds it in sort of mysticism and makes it, sort of hard to get at, because it sounds like you're saying the wrong words, and I could go on and on and on about it. It's endlessly frustrating to me. But I will say it was intimidating sitting across from Lynn and Aaron, both of whom were very eloquent people. Lynn had been in wine, I think she was 27 when she started as the winemaker at Rex Hill, and she'd been somewhere else before that, and she'd been doing it her whole life. Mm-hmm. They were both just hawks for flaws. And we would taste first thing in the morning all the time. And, there wasn't really any shaming if you couldn't smell anything. But, you're sitting around a table with 3 other people and they're all saying one thing, and I'm looking at my notes, kind of quickly trying to scribble things out and write something else. I'm like, okay, I'm way off here, clearly. But it got me really thinking critically about, how I smell things mm-hmm. in all parts of my life. That sense is the one that you probably think about the least. Mm-hmm. Even though it's probably the oldest one that we have. It's very deeply tied into your memory. There's always that thing where you're smelling something and you're like, I know what this is. I just can't I can't come up with the word. I mean, it's because it's probably not a word. It's probably not a what, it's probably a when. Mm-hmm. That it was a confluence of things that's reminding you of a time that you just can't quite grasp. Mm-hmm. And so it was probably the most important thing I learned, at least early on in my career, was just learning how to taste wine with Lynn. Mm-hmm. I'm very grateful to her to this day for it. And she's trained many, many others than me. I mean, I feel like everybody in the wine industry at one point worked for Lynn at Rex Hill. So yeah, and I enjoyed it. I was fortunate that I got to move up there pretty quickly because people were moving on to other jobs. I mean, even Lynn was sort of, she'd established her brand in 1998, still under Rex Hill, but I mean, I think her transition was apparent even before I was hired. So I got to move up pretty quick. The waters parted for me. I think one could debate maybe even a little quicker than they should have for me to be able to move up from within that company, but I certainly wasn't going to say no. Mm-hmm. I mean, at that point I was in it. I knew what I wanted to do. I was very ambitious, and I wanted to be sort of climbing the ladder as fast as I could. If I could go back, I would probably tell my younger self maybe not to do that, but that's how it happened.
Mm-hmm. So what point does it click in from I want to just sort of see this process to now I have an ambition to climb the ladder, I have an ambition, I know what I want to do. What point did that kind of sink in as like, this is where I want to be, I want to continue this career and get to this point?
Well, I think once Lynn had transitioned to Penner-Ash and I was working with Aaron, Aaron and I were really good friends, and Aaron was just constantly questioning everything. I mean, the whole thing had become, there's how we'd made it when Lynn was there, and Aaron kept parts of that, but he also swept most of it right off the table and began to just reimagine the whole thing, both out in the vineyard and in the winery. And so I was learning a huge amount. Mm-hmm. Both, hey, maybe we should try this, and hey, maybe we really should not have tried that. But Aaron was willing to make mistakes. He was willing to, he wanted to see the process grow, and he's like, if we're going to do that, we are going to swing and miss sometimes. But it's important that we keep trying and keep pushing. And that's what I wanted. And I was, trying to think about Rex Hill at that point was getting bigger too. A to Z hadn't bought it yet, but we were putting up like these big, giant, like missile silo looking tanks that started to show up, and we were making some wine for them. And I knew I never wanted to work at a production winery, a big winery. I'd seen, little bits of that in the parent company I worked for in Burgundy, where the bottling line takes up an entire building. And I wanted those skills. Like, I wanted to know how to run a bottling line. That's what I did, kind of year 2 through 4 at Rex Hill. To become comfortable with the equipment, to become comfortable with fixing the equipment if we break it. My brother was working with me at that point, and he was actually working for me, but we sort of worked it out to where we sort of shared the job. We would just, figure out, okay, here's the work for the day. What do you want to do? What should I do? And luckily, John was always much better at fixing things than I was. We made a very good team at Rex Hill that I would sort of work on the why, and John would work on the how, and we could get things done really quickly. But I never really thought about Bethel Heights. I think I still sort of thought of that as my dad's job. My father's had Parkinson's disease since he was 56. And I didn't realize sort of how much work other people were helping him do. His assistant, Rob Kowal, will forever be a part of the fabric here at Bethel Heights. He still comes to visit. Rob still writes handwritten letters to us sometimes, which I love about Rob. If you knew him, it's very on brand. But he was, I think, really helping guide a lot of the stylistic decisions at Bethel Heights, because my father was having a harder and harder time smelling wine, which, without your nose, you're sort of lost. Lynn was consulting with my dad a little bit. He'd also hired Kyriakos Kingopopoulos, who's the famous Greek-French consultant, was working with my father at that point. And so I sort of just figured it was covered, and this was his dream, and along with my uncle and my Aunt Pat and my mother Marilyn. And I never wanted to come and impose my will on any of that. It was never my intention to come work here. I was sort of putting out feelers to Mike Etzel at Beaufrere, to a couple of other people saying, hey, I think I'm ready to move to something else. But I was still not ready to move. I wasn't ready to come crashing through a ceiling yet. I wanted to go work for somebody like Mike, as an example, or Doug Tennell or Harry Peterson Edry, where I knew I'd hit the ceiling the minute I walked through the door. That it was either them or their child were eventually going to be steering the ship, and I would just try to help them get there, follow instructions, take out the trash, whatever was needed to be done. I wasn't ready, I think, for a full-blown, at the controls job. But all of a sudden, there it was. My dad approached me and said, "Hey, I'm going to retire. I think it's time. I have other things I want to do with my life beyond this. I don't want this to devolve into nepotism, where I hire somebody and you think you can come and sort of sweep them out of the way at some point." That's one thing I love about my dad, is he's a fantastic communicator, and was always very sort of clear. There was never any gray area with my father. It was always very like, this is the way it is. What do you think about that? And I wrestled with it. I really did. I wasn't expecting it. And I wasn't sure at 27 that I wanted to take a job that I might retire from. I know how this sort of ties you down. Especially with the growing season, I never wanted to be, a winemaker in title only, that I just, hire some poor assistant winemaker, make them do all the work, and then I take all the credit. I didn't want that. I didn't want to become, the celebrity chef who doesn't cook anymore. Because I wanted whatever I did to be, sort of functioning at the highest level I was capable. And I at first said no, and then I thought about it, and it occurred to me, I'll be an owner no matter what someday. If this all gets too close, if I can't work with my family, if it turns out my dad was saying he was ready to let go, but really wasn't ready to let go, we can always hire somebody else. And so, yeah, I started here. I gave my notice to Aaron. It was before harvest of 2004. I wanted to give him time. So I stayed on for about 4 months as they transitioned somebody new in. And then I started working here. It's always easy to remember. I started working here January 1st of 2005.
When you came in, what were your expectations for how your role would fit in with the family, and for what you would need to do, and like what were your kind of initial goals or initial projects?
Well, my dad, to his credit, turns out was not bluffing. He literally said, "Okay, this 2005 harvest is yours. If you need help, sort of negotiating anything, because it's never just one person at Bethel Heights. I mean, it's the family, it's a team." Rob was still there and had ideas about how the wine was being made. I think he also was about ready to transition out, but I think he was actually probably having a harder time letting go than my dad was. And I was ambitious and naive and wanted to sort of impose what I thought the right way to do it was immediately. And to my dad's credit, he let me. He didn't stand in my way. And to be fair, I didn't change much the first year. 2005, we were sort of weaving in between the raindrops all through harvest. It was a vintage that was sort of defined by several different rain events. And at least I knew then that grape quality would always outperform anything that I was going to do in the cellar. I mean, I at least had that one. I had lots of other really bad ideas, but I at least had that one good idea. And in 2005, making sort of delicate, more nimble, lightly colored wines. I mean, that's what was going to happen at Bethel Heights in 2005, regardless of what I did. And so we sort of leaned into that. I was really proud of the vintage. It was the kind of wines that I thought should be, and I use this word intentionally, made at Bethel Heights, because I was still very much inside the four walls, a winery-focused person. They were low in alcohol, they were high in acidity, they were all distinctly different from each other. It was exactly what I'd wanted. And again, sort of naively, heading into 2006, I was like, okay, that wasn't so bad. We got it. We're not going to make big, extracted, high octane, high ethanol, jammy wines. That's not what's going to happen here, because that's not what just happened here. And then 2006 rolled around, and I made a whole bunch of them. I made wines, touching 14.8% alcohol. They were chewy, they were dense, they were tannic, and I was not remotely proud of them. And that's probably the most critically successful vintage that Bethel Heights had probably ever had. And I was sort of aghast at, sort of what I had wrought, in vintage 2006. And, at that point, my cousin Mimi was also working at the winery in a variety of different roles, and she had started, begun to voice, some things that she'd wanted to do first out in the vineyard with her dad. And so there was sort of a group of us now sort of looking at, I'd always tried to be inclusive and do tastings with everybody, but I still had a pretty clear idea of what I wanted to do. And I think the 2005 and 2006 vintage put it into pretty clear reprieve that maybe I didn't know what I was doing, because we had made two sets of wines that bore no resemblance to each other. And so, at that point, I think I became a lot more receptive to everybody. Like, let's talk this through. My dad and my uncle, I think still even to this day, I mean, critical success for them was that's what are you talking about? This is great. I mean, we got some good scores. Good scores mean better sales. I mean, I'd grown up here, not realizing that we were in, land rich, but cash poor. I mean, I when I was old enough, I wore my dad's clothes and John wore mine. I mean, my mom had to go get another job just because we weren't making that much money. I didn't realize that, and it's a gift my parents gave me. As people talk about the gift of poverty without realizing that you have it. I didn't grow up very attached to material things. I'm still not to this day, because we didn't really have anything. Eventually money came into the other side of the family, and that's how Justice Vineyard was purchased. As Pat and my uncle, Ted, I think didn't really know much about the stock market. He didn't want to, had to put the money somewhere, and he's like, well, this is the thing I know. So more vineyard land was planted, all really with the idea of protecting the business of these old, the vines here are old and own-rooted and someday are going to die. And the idea with Justice Vineyard was, we'll have another established property that we can take the grapes from when we're rapidly replanting Bethel Heights. And so, yeah, I mean, that's sort of how it began for me at Bethel Heights. I mean, there was always the push-pull. You know, my uncle, still is our vineyard manager day to day today. And it's still always an argument about what constitutes a ripe grape. But we've made it work now for, I've been here for 15 years now, I think. And I think despite the fact that we're related, we still do communicate well with each other. We're respectful of each other, even when we disagree. I think we've done a pretty good job of being able to work it through. And I think I've finally gotten wrapped my arms a little bit more around what I want my voice in the vineyard to be. It took a long time. I remember Ed Palladino, who owns E&R Wine Shop, love Ed, in Portland, quoted Miles Davis once as it related to wine, and I rip it off all the time. As lots of things Ed say, I just repeat later. Miles Davis said, it takes a long time sometimes to sound like yourself. And I think in the wine world, you only get to do it so many times. I mean, you do it once a year. It's not like beer where you can be like, oh, well, that didn't work out, and you get some malt and some hops and some water, and you start all over again. I mean, here you have the entire sort of year to stew about what you did well and maybe wish you would have done better, and you only get to do it. I mean, I was lucky enough to start pretty young, maybe 50 times. So, I mean, to me, I think it's necessary always to be looking back and evaluating where you were, rather than just constantly looking ahead. I think wine sort of uniquely lends itself to that, because the wine, its life in my hands, ends when we put it in the bottle, but it then takes on a completely different life after that. Yeah. It's probably kind of a long-winded answer to your question.
That's a great answer. I'm curious about, you mentioned kind of the unique ownership structure here at Bethel Heights, and kind of having to find that balance between your vision and your voice leadership and the consensus of the group. So tell me about how that happened after the first couple of years. You've made these two very different wines. You're not, the second one has made everybody else happy except for you. So what happens next?
Well, I think I'd gotten more comfortable. I guess I'd gotten more comfortable with my dad being comfortable with me changing things. As I said, the 2006s, I was not proud of them, but I could see my dad was. And to me, that was sort of an affirmation that, okay, I can sort of, I don't want to say inflict my will upon the winemaking process, but I can take some bigger chances. I can change, things in the barrel program maybe that he wouldn't have changed. I could start leaning on my uncle to maybe start doing a couple of things a little bit different, which, to his credit, he was receptive to. And so I started, I started trying to approach it. I mean, unfortunately, it was still inside out at that point. It was still, okay, we have grapes, now what? It wasn't all of the things leading up to the grapes showing up on the crush pad. But I think, I cleaned things a lot more thoroughly than my dad ever did. I mean, a lot of that was adopted from Rex Hill. It was a lot of procedures that, I think, like Rob has said it to me. I have a very good friend who I won't name, but he's like, well, Ben, natural processes really want to finish on their own without you meddling around. And I'm like, that's true. I mean, alcoholic fermentation does want to finish to dryness. Malolactic fermentation does want to finish until there's no more malic acid. Unfortunately, acetic acid also wants to finish until there's no more alcohol. There's just acetic acid. I mean, there's lots of natural processes. Not all of them lend themselves to something that's going to taste good in a bottle. So I think I spent the first couple of years, this is going to be a really boring answer, but just sort of tidying up cellar hygiene. I leaned into whole clusters just because, I feel like that's a wave that just keeps crashing in the industry. It's like everybody thinks it's a good idea until it's not, and then 10 years later it's like, have we ever thought about using whole clusters? Now I only really do it when I get a new assistant winemaker and they approach me and like, have you ever thought about whole bunches? And I'm like, yeah, but to appease their curiosity, we'll try it again. But I guess, technique-wise, we were trying lots of different things. And what I had come to realize is the more sort of proficient I'd become in the cellar and in the lab and looking at products and looking at percentages of stems and different coopers and things like that, is that tasting through the cellar, it almost started to become more a reflection on procedure than what part of the vineyard things had come from. I think 2008 was a vintage that I became sort of acutely aware of that. It was a year, I mean, it was considered one of the best vintages Oregon's ever had. I think that was more of a North Valley experience than ours sort of in the Mid Valley, because I mean, we were still sort of right on that margin of getting ripe. But the wines were big. I was proud of them, but as we were trying to make blending decisions, I mean, it was sort of just a parade of big, dark, monochromatic wines. And I'd kind of begun to realize that procedurally, I think I had started to twist things in a direction I'd never wanted it to be. I mean, you sort of asked about a family business at the beginning of this. It can't be a cult of personality. It can't be, these are Ben Casteel's wines. Mm-hmm. It has to be that these are Bethel Heights wines. Mm-hmm. And my father understood that. It took me a couple of years to understand that. So I backed way off on almost every subsequent vintage, trying to, not necessarily to tailor our winemaking to each individual spot on the property, because that again almost felt a little too much like tinkering. I mean, I think it sort of swung from one pole to the other. But you know, to their credit, my family's always been pretty comfortable with me doing that. You know, my dad was enjoying the wines. I think Ted was. We were successful. You know, I think Mimi had begun to sort of see, in terms of some of the structure, maybe the wines were getting a little too big, and I think she was right. I sort of had it in my head that, you know, sort of our wines they weren't as expensive as they are now, but they were still expensive sort of in my eyes. And I was like, you know, if we're going to build something that's going to be good in 25 years or good in 30 years, is it a foregone conclusion that it then has to taste bad for the first 10? Mm-hmm. And it's a silly way to think, but I was sort of looking at some of the sort of supernals of Burgundy. I mean, the things that I couldn't afford or didn't even know how to find, that people like Gary Andrus were nice enough, you know, the original founder of Archery Summit, was nice enough to open for little old me. And, you know, he'd say, what do you think? And I'd say, I think that tastes like the dirt and rocks it's planted in and nothing like fruit. Mm-hmm. And he's like, well, Ben, it's only 10 years old. And I somehow gotten that in my head. And I think our 2008 vintage is still a reflection on that. It's like, you know, the vintage of endless promise that someday these are going to taste great. And many days have now gone by and they still sort of taste exactly the same. But no, I think, you know, in terms of the family dynamic, winemaking was never really much of an issue. Where it became a bigger issue, I think, was always, and this predates me, was stewardship of the land and how we farm our property. My cousin really started leaning hard into that in 2014. We hadn't used herbicides in a long time at that point, but I think Mimi still felt like, you know, in terms of how much we're driving tractors through the vineyard and things like that, that, you know, that change needed to come, that we can be doing a better job, that we don't need to clear more land to plant more vineyards, because at that point we're cutting down trees that we probably shouldn't be cutting down. And she applied a huge amount of pressure, followed by her mother, my Aunt Pat. At that point, I think they decided to plant another vineyard on the east side of the hills, where my cousin now lives and works and sells grapes. I think mainly just because Mimi needed an outlet for all, you know, the ideas that were just, I felt like, just bursting out of her head at the time. I mean, she was just a walking, you know, fountain of great ideas, you know, walking around the winery, walking around the vineyard. And I think, you know, her dad, you know, he'd been doing it for a long time. I think Ted never really wanted to let go the way my dad, I mean, he didn't have a disease that was causing him to. But I think that they still wanted to be supportive of everything that was suddenly, you know, happening. And so Mimi now, you know, farms Hopewell. You know, we share a crew with her, but she does a lot. I mean, you go out there, she's out there a lot herself. And I think seeing her do that in a lot of ways kind of inspired me to spend more time outside. That you know, I felt like within four walls I'd sort of accomplished what I always liked the idea that we can keep doing it better and keep pushing better. But at that point, you know, we'd refined things enough to, I think we needed a couple years of perspective just to see, in terms of procedure, okay, this worked out pretty well. Let's take a couple steps back. Let's keep looking at it, but, you know, let's not just tweak this thing to death. And, you know, my assistant winemaker at the time, and I spent a lot more time outside, And then when he left and I hired my new assistant winemaker, I mean, I purposefully hired somebody who was mainly vineyard focused and not so much winery. I mean, he can do both. He's a very talented guy, Bob Taylor. But I specifically wanted to hire somebody who was going to sort of help push us outside more. And I think that, to kind of bring full circle to the question I feel like you asked a long time ago, as a family, I think that's sort of where we've always landed. I mean, I was always so wine focused that I was just aghast when things didn't work out the way I wanted. And I kind of began to realize that, as long as the wines weren't destroyed, that everybody was kind of like, no, it tastes pretty good. And I'm like, we need to be doing so much better than it tastes pretty good. And they're like, well, I think it tastes good. And they like walk away from me. But in terms of how we were farming and in terms of how we were approaching our property, I think that's sort of where we all kind of came to, I won't say hive mind, because there's still lots of disagreements about, how we're farming and why we're farming the way we do and why taking all these extra steps are important, even if they're not remotely efficient. But that's been a neat thing for me. I think, even having been here for 15 years, that I feel like over the last few, sort of at my cousin's inadvertent urging, that it sort of pushed us to really evaluate our farming practices much more fundamentally, and not just how they affect our little corner of the world, but how they could have a broader effect. And that's been really important, certainly for my cousin and my aunt, but also for me, and I think my uncle as well.
It's really interesting knowing Bethel Heights' role in getting live certification up and running, that you still felt the need to push it further. So tell me about, in that evolution in the last few years, what are the biggest things you've sort of tried to transition in the vineyard? What were the things you thought you could do better?
Well, the live program, I think, started in what is now my office at Bethel, but was then our tasting room. I think our 1999 estate was the first wine to have the live certification. It was my uncle and Al McDonald and a bunch of people whose names I'm probably going to forget. One of the things I've liked about the live program is it's whole property. So you can't, not like organic where you can just target little pieces. It's the whole farm. And I think it was originally intended, to get people gradually, because nobody had a lot of money back then. Well, some people did, but a lot of the families didn't. That there's sort of where you want to get, and then there's how you can afford to get there. And frankly, chemical farming is a whole lot cheaper than mechanical farming. So it was meant to be inclusive, that there was this sort of merit demerit list. Where I think live has done really well is it moved into not just the vineyard, but also into the winery, and beyond the winery into how our wine begins to move out into the world, how we engage the world and how we sell it. In terms of messaging, in terms of public education, I think it's been phenomenal. When we put in a 60 kilowatt solar array, I sort of thought that live always has a continual improvement list. And I sort of thought that a 60 kilowatt solar array would have that's the last thing I ever have to write on that list, because it's such a huge offset. And I was quickly told, nope, that's great, you did that last year. What are you doing? What are you doing moving forward? And I think that has been profoundly impactful for our industry. It sort of has helped shape some of the direction that the Willamette Valley Wineries Association is currently going, with looking at packaging, with looking at the weights of bottles and things like that. Where I think live has sort of not been progressive enough is in the vineyard. I think it is still a merit demerit system. It does still allow some amount of chemical farming, and it has been inclusive. Try to say this a little diplomatically, so I'm not having you edit it later. It's become inclusive of a couple of bigger wineries that help pay people's salaries. And if you start taking hard lines on things, I get it. You start losing income, but it's what has led us to now pursue farming organically. I say we, Mimi should really be the one taking credit for at least the nugget that began all of this. It was her idea. But I think we've really embraced it. So we'll now carry, hopefully, we've done 3 years of being on our organic spray program. We'll get certified at some point this year. And it's been really important for me that we do both. I think the whole farm certification is important with live. I think its look at our footprint beyond vines is really, really important. but I think being progressive in terms of farming sustainably, getting away from herbicides and systemic chemicals is also very, very important for at least what we want to do. It's not lost on me in the last couple of years that we're only spraying sulfur, but we're driving a big heavy tractor with a big heavy sprayer attached to it twice as many times through our vineyard, and it's these sort of unintended consequences of getting away from certain things. I mean, I remember I was on the technical committee for Live for a little while, and we just ended up going down a rabbit hole of, okay, what chemicals are softer than others? Okay, well, how are those chemicals manufactured and refined? Okay, well, what kind of equipment do they use to go and do? I mean, you just go down, and it's just like, oh my, we shouldn't be using anything. We shouldn't be using anything at all. So it's challenging, but I think it's something our industry has done very, very well. Is to look at, okay, here's how we can do it. Now, how do we do it in a way that's more sustainable, that's a softer impact on the land that we work, and really continuing that education, beyond just telling ourselves that we're doing a good job, but also engaging, consumers, in why this is important. And it's not just important in terms of how we buy wine, but how we buy everything.
So when it comes to your work, what has this kind of evolution added to your plate? What are you doing differently now yourself than you were before?
Well, I think it was always meant as a joke about biodynamics that you're not really fundamentally doing anything differently. You're just out in your vineyard so much more because of all these little extra steps you're supposed to be taking. And I think there's actually some truth in that. That, if we're only spraying sulfur, I mean, our last 2 summers have been humid. In Oregon, is if nothing else, not humid, but yet here it is. So, I mean, like walk behinds, putting out little spray cards to make sure we're actually hitting what we think we're hitting with the sprayer. I mean, you do spend a lot more time out and engaged with the crop. And I think, in doing that, you see trouble earlier. You see places where maybe we could be doing a better job in terms of, whether it's, not cultivation, but when you're really out there, actually, I will say cultivation. We got into that this year. We've been a firm no-till property for a long time, but if you're actually out there bouncing around on the tractor, you start to realize that the gophers have been living large out here for a long time and sort of expanding their little network. And your equipment's breaking. You're watching the sprayer sort of go through the vine row like this, and the spray's kind of going like this. And it makes you think more intentionally about what you're doing. That you can't be so philosophically tied to something that there is no ground to, like, okay, we know we're not going to do this, but how do we, if we stay in this lane, how do we do it better? How do we do it efficiently? How do we make it so we're not breaking farm implements left and right? So I think just being outside and being engaged a lot more has been helpful. I mean, we are a small company, so sorry about that. I think, you can't be everywhere at once. We only have so many family members. Generation 3 is still not that old yet. So, we don't have a national sales manager. So I end up flying around the country and doing some of that. We have another employee, Betsy Reed, who helps me and does a great job. But I mean, I think where I've grown professionally in as it relates to this is sort of realizing you can't do it all yourself. Either in the winemaking process, in viticulture, in running a small business. I mean, you can't do it all. And so I've, sort of reluctantly handed a couple of little things off here and there. And I think it's made us a stronger company. It still makes me a little uncomfortable, but I do think it has made us a stronger company in all facets, in winemaking, in grape growing, and keeping our little business afloat, and then engaging with the industry at large.
You mentioned something when you're talking about the kind of organics as the consumer side of things. So I'm curious, from your perspective, how have you seen consumers of wine change in the time you've been selling them wine, and what are they demanding of you now that maybe they weren't demanding before?
That's a great question. It's a big one. I think one thing I'll say is there's more people drinking wine right now in the world than there have ever been. Wine has been growing and growing and growing, which I think is a good thing. I think, but with that, of course, comes there is the industrial side of it. I mean, I think, when people see Western European brands, they just assume that they're all some tiny little mom and pop, tiny little winery with a subterranean cellar. And, you go to the south of France and you're very quickly disabused of all of that. I mean, I think it was true a few years ago. I think it still is that, between Spain, Italy, and France, that's half the wine in the world right there. So I think, younger consumers, I think are always going to be more engaged and willing to try weirder and weirder stuff. And there's certainly enough weird stuff out there for them to try right now. I think, wine has diversified. All of the sort of goofball Italian varieties that used to go into Chianti, for example, are now just being vinified. I mean, I feel like every time I go to the Italian wine section of a cool wine shop, I'm like, I've never heard of that, and it's all grown on Mount Etna, but but I love that as a consumer. I love that there's all these new things that they're, even in parts of the world where it's about as established as it could be, that, a millennia have gone by and it's worked for that long. Why change it? And yet it's changing. And I think a lot of that is, as usual, is driven by younger people who are priced out of certain areas and go and explore others that maybe haven't been planted yet. I think established consumers, we're very lucky. We have a very loyal direct consumer base who are sort of, even comfortable with my father transitioning to me. Some of them have been with us for that long. There was a part of me that was a little bit worried about that, that the chef leaves the restaurant and all the consumers go with him or her. But I don't know. I mean, I think people seem more willing to try new things. I think that, unfortunately, people also see wine as less of an investment anymore. I think the notion that the bottle is passing from our hands to our consumers' hands into their cellar, I don't maybe think that happens as much as I'd like it to. I think wine's consumed earlier and earlier, and I think a lot of times, unfortunately, wine's also being made that way, not just in Oregon, but also in parts of Western Europe, to where I thought that would never change. So it's dynamic, and I think there's always things the trends you like to see, and some others that are a little bit more worrisome. But I think just the fact that wine is one of those things we can have conversations beyond what's in the glass over, like how we're farming. Like if you and I were sitting here just eating an apple, I mean, we'd probably end up talking about baseball or something like that. We wouldn't be going into this deep, thoughtful conversation about, wow, where did this apple come from? Who grew this apple? And of course, with other beverages, it's like with spirits or with beer, it's a lot more about process. I think wine is a springboard to so many other things because it is from a place. It is, well, I mean, not all of them, but let's keep it with Oregon for an example. That it is Willamette Valley, and then it's from somewhere within the Willamette Valley, and then it's from this vineyard in that place in the Willamette Valley. And the AVAs have nice tidy lines drawn around them, but that's not to say that they're uniform at all. I mean, where we're sitting right now compared to the east side of the northern tip of the Eola Hills bears almost no resemblance to the wines we make here. And you can just keep diving down deeper and deeper and deeper, and I think wine allows for that. And I think it tends to, I mean, I hate saying this, but I think it's true that at least historically, wine has been the beverage of the affluent, who I think are maybe a little bit more willing to engage in that sort of conversation. I don't think it's as true now, but it's a way then for us to then reach a broader audience to talk about, thinking about how things are farmed. You can speak volumes with how you spend your money and what you spend it on. And I think it's been, a trend that I've really been happy to see spread throughout many different disciplines now and many different kinds of businesses that are sort of weaving that thread in.
Talking about AVAs, and obviously you mentioned earlier that you're far from what people generally think of as Oregon wine country, right? Oregon wine country, North Valley, Dundee area. Tell me about the evolution of this AVA and of the addition of all your neighbors. And of the kind of, has that been a struggle for you, a battle for you to be, to not be kind of in the heart of what traditionally is considered wine country?
I think probably from a business standpoint, yes. I mean, for a long time, the Eola Amity Hills, it's the farthest away from Portland. It's the farthest away from our commercial airport. When I lived in Portland and I'd have friends who would come and visit me and they'd want to go to wine country, we'd be up sort of knocking around in the Dundee Hills, and they're like, "What? We're not going to your place?" I'm like, "Oh, it's too far. It's just too far." And I had a vested interest in it, and I still didn't go. And I think it's cooler here. I mean, I think that gets brought up a lot. The Eola's Keeper of the Winds is sort of the namesake of the Eola Amity Hills. We sit right in the mouth of the Van Duzer corridor. So I mean, I think Eola Amity Hills producers I think occasionally start to like to talk about the wind like we own it. We don't. It affects the whole valley. I mean, McMinnville's quite windy too. The Van Duzer AVA that obviously is quite windy. But it affects us, and I think that's viewed as a positive thing now that we've had a string had a string of warmer vintages. It didn't feel that way when I first started. There are some of the oldest vines on our property. We have the Wente clone of Chardonnay on a big hanging trellis. Planted in 1977. We have Vadensville, same way. Those are both late ripening varieties that, they were always sort of the harbinger of, the end of harvest. It's like, okay, when are we done? It's like, when are we pick those? And like, when are we going to pick them? Like, we'll look at the weather and it's like, okay, it's going to start raining constantly starting on the 15th of October. And it's like, okay, well, that's the end of harvest. And we'll just get them as ripe, cross our fingers and get them as ripe as we can. So, I mean, there's been years where I've been very thankful, for the cooling effect that we get in the evening. And there's been years where I've been just bitterly resentful of it. I mean, 2011, I mean, I was talking to some of my friends on the phone. They're like, whew, glad we got through that. And I was like, yeah, we still haven't picked half of our grapes. It all worked out in 2011, but I mean, it does sort of put us a little closer to that margin of viticulture where you get the grapes as ripe as you were able to versus as ripe as you want to. When they were defining the AVAs, there was a very sort of ill-conceived tasting of sitting down and tasting all the AVAs. I actually think they were tasting the 2006 vintage, where they sat and okay, like, what do these all taste like? And of course, a big hot year, they all taste. You probably could have slipped a couple of Russian River wines on the table, and we'd have been like, oh, is that Yamhill Carlton, maybe? So, I think there is always a little bit of folly in that, of trying to, that these attributes are the Eola Amity Hills, that these attributes are the Dundee Hills, because there's always exceptions. I mean, it's such an easy thing to poke holes in, and I'll try not to be cynical and do that here. It was funny, Ken Wright, I don't think Ken would be mad at me for saying this, when we were talking about, because he was one of the real driving forces behind, Gary Andrus being the other, of sort of defining the AVAs. As you always said, the Eola Hills, it's, the wines are rustic. And to me, I always thought, is that just a nice way of saying tannic? Is that just a slightly nicer way of saying tannic? Because that is a thing here. I mean, it's windy, so, the vines will try to protect the crop, the things with the seeds in them, so they'll thicken the skins, so, more color, and at least more potential for phenolics. And I think, this speaks to a question you'd asked me a while ago about, things that changed over the year. I mean, I leaned into that when I first started at Bethel Heights, and I've now been at least sort of attempting to lean a little bit back out of it because, I mean, we do have just tremendous phenolic potential here. But again, we're sort of straddling the spine of the Eola Amity Hills. You go onto the other side of the hill, and that's not the case. It's like, Dundee, for example, in terms of AVAs, I mean, it's not just there's Marsh here and Weber here and, Erath's here, and, you drive that road and you're like, oh yeah, you taste the wine, you're like, yeah, I get it. Then you go over by Archery Summit, and you're just kind of just right on the other side, and you're like, I don't get it. I don't get it. And, I mean, I like both, but I'm like, I mean, one does not necessarily speak to the other. So I mean, there's so much to it. It's why I've always been hesitant about drawing lines around things. I think there's parts of geography and geology where you get sure if you have to draw a line around something, but I mean, to me, lines have always been. I don't want it to be the sort of preamble of, okay, we've defined the place, wines taste really good, now let's start drawing lines of pedigree around that place. I mean, being in Burgundy, I was sort of, I was surprised, mainly I was running around with my little map, making sure I wasn't sampling somebody else's rows, the Clos de Vougeot or whatever. I mean, it's confusing, but you realize that you're standing in a vineyard where, they're going to charge $500 a bottle for this minimum. And then I walk 50 feet and I'm standing in a vineyard where it's probably going to be more like 50. And not that the money that we can get a whole different topic about, what's wine worth. But I was always sort of shocked by that, and it's one of the reasons I've always been sort of hesitant about. I mean, the Eola Amity Hills, I mean, in a way, it's the sort of easiest one to defend because it's the one that sort of sits all off by itself. The others all sort of are nestled around each other, whereas we're, kind of off in the middle somewhere. I will say, I have very few regrets about, certainly working here and being 100% estate. The one thing I sort of miss being at Rex Hill is they bought grapes from everywhere. I mean, Lynn had positioned Rex Hill in, I think, probably 5 or 6 of the best vineyards in the state. And it was really fun for me early in my career tasting wines that were good, that were to great, that had nothing to do with each other, that were at complete far-flung opposite parts of the spectrum. And I'd seen how they were made. I'd helped, make them with Lynn, and I'd seen her direction, and Lynn's direction was usually pretty, she's like, no, we're not going to just do this over here and completely treat this differently. I mean, she had a process because we were making place-driven wines. She's like, no, I mean, we can't be the thing. The thing has to be the thing. And I was lucky, my dad is very much the same way when I started working here. It was, no, we make place-driven wines. We don't make personality-driven wines. He's like, if you, there's one that has your last name on it, so if you feel just bound and determined to do so, that's your one, where you can do that. So yeah, I do miss being, sort of knocking around the valley, but, I can always just go taste with my friends and essentially achieve the same thing.
So I want to talk about the place a little bit because you mentioned 100% estate. Tell me about learning the place. How long did it take you to learn this place, and how has that informed your winemaking?
Well, as I spoke earlier, I got to walk through the door here with vines that were as old as I was. I mean, it wasn't like a lot of my peers who were sort of, beginning careers with young fledgling brands with an expectation that, okay, we're going to charge a lot of money for these wines, and the plants are sticks in the ground. I mean, when I came here, we had a mature estate, and I was very fortunate in that. I think that probably covered up a lot of early mistakes that I probably would have made had I not had that. I mean, Bethel Heights proper is 57 planted acres. I grew up in it. I at least in terms of the sort of lay of the land, I had a pretty good idea of how things had tasted. The flat block had been bottled separately since 1991. The southeast block had been bottled separately since 1991. The west block followed suit not long after. But then, there was Justice Vineyard that had just been put in the ground in 1999. That was the year I was graduating college. I was aware of its existence, but I didn't really know what kind of wines I was going to make. And then, so there was a lot of new things that I sort of got to grow up with. I was lucky I had a lot of good advice that, don't set your expectations too high for baby vines, that they're going to reflect a when. Like they'll show the vintage, and if you do your job well, hopefully they'll taste like Pinot, but let's not make any big, broad, sweeping statements about the terroir of the place with a 10-year-old vineyard. I did it anyway. I mean, I didn't take anybody's advice. But that's been a neat thing. We have some sort of established stalwart blocks that I feel like no matter how I've fussed with them over the years, they speak in their own voice. That my fingerprints aren't smeared all over them. And then seeing those sort of moments where, like we have on the east side of the property, for example, we have a block of Pomard, a block of 777, and a block of 115. They're all young. They were all planted in 2002, and you make your determinations about them, and like this is pretty good, and this one's not as good, and then there's a year where suddenly everything changes, and suddenly everything tastes different. We taste everything blind here a lot, and there's always that. I actually kind of relish those years where I look stupid in front of all of my employees because I'm like, oh, I think this is this and this, and then we take bags off, and I'm completely wrong about all of it, because it is a dynamic thing, but it just because it's it's like watching a child grow up or a pet. You don't realize the thing's getting bigger. I mean, you sort of have moments where you realize things are getting bigger. Like, suddenly your kids' clothes don't fit anymore. But it's not like you see them, you take a 3-year gap, and then you see them again, and it's sort of this, destabilizing moment. I think wine still allows for that because, you're around the vine all year long, but you haven't made wine from it for an entire year. And so those moments of sort of, the year where suddenly everything changed, you still get to be surprised by that. And I thought when I first started working here that Justice was sort of a big dark fruited, tannic, monochromatic site. I was told that it's mainly marine sediment. Turns out that's not true because we started digging holes. But I thought, okay, this is a known quality. This is a voice, and we'll make a justice, and it almost doesn't matter which blocks I pull it from. Sorry, I'm pointing at something you guys can't see. I hate it when people do that. We can make little tweaks, but these are going to be mainly winemaking barrel tweaks or whatever, to make the wine taste the best way we can. And now, when I taste through Justice, it's more like a chorus of voices, all at different timbres and things like that. There's so much more going on down there than from what I remember in my first year. I mean, I helped my dad blend the 2004 vintage and then made the 2005 vintage to the way I view it now. And I just could not be. It was controversial in the early going because my dad didn't think it was going to be a good site. Ted did. Ted was right. And now that Bethel Heights owns it and has sort of absorbed it into the fold, I mean, I am so thankful that they did that. And that's it's a neat thing about a generational business. We've actually just purchased our neighbor's property, Lumen Vineyard too, and there's 10 plantable acres down there. And it's one of these things that, just to give you an example, like the Wente Chardonnay, I mean, I mentioned that was sort of the end of harvest. It's the latest ripening thing we have. I was so resentful of that for so many years. I'm like, who thought this was a good idea? I don't want to make sparkling wine, but that's probably what it's best suited to. We don't need a giant safety net of acidity underneath all of our other Chardonnay. Our Chardonnays are acidic just by virtue of where we are. We don't need to, a sort of superimposed version of that on top. But now it looks prescient. It's probably making the most compelling white wine that we produce now. And I think about that a lot now. Should we be looking to plant things that are going to look pretty foolish for probably the next 10 years? In order to set up whomever's kid for generation number 3 to walk through the door with something that's established and not, young baby vines sort of just trying to survive, let alone make compelling wine. It's something we talk about a lot. I mean, I think as a generational business, we need, there's the short view and then there's the very long view. And with the very long view, profitability almost can't be a part of the conversation. I mean, we can't get out the P&L sheet and start scratching our heads and, getting on our phones and using the calculator and trying to figure it doesn't work that way. I mean, it's just be like, no, this is a really bad idea right now. But in 10 or 20 years, it could look like a really good idea.
It's really interesting. Well, I'm going to come back to that in a minute. I'm curious about a couple things. You talked about kind of enjoying the process of bringing young people in, interns and young people into the industry, into Bethel Heights and teaching them and of looking for things in your employees that kind of push the business forward. So tell me, as you have evolved into your role, tell me about what you look for when you bring people in and what you're hoping to kind of get from them and give to them and kind of the mentor-mentee relationship.
Well, I mean, I've always been a fairly inquisitive person, and so I think I naturally tend to gravitate towards that in other people. I like having people who are coming from an outside perspective. I mean, like, for example, I haven't always necessarily for interns hired people that have any idea what they're doing in a winery at all. They see pumps and hoses and they're like, oh no, what have I gotten myself into? Not all of them. I mean, I usually like to have at least a couple of sort of experienced people who, this isn't all foreign material to them, but I like having new perspectives, people who've come from different careers and different industries. I mean, I think you sort of find where there's ambition and where you can foster it. I mean, we're a small company, so obviously there's not huge amounts of things to do, but, I think anywhere where you can broaden somebody's skill set is important. I'm not a big believer in that, you find somebody who can do your job for half the money and then you hire them and then you just go do something else. I've never liked that idea. I mean, I think I like being close to the work. I like being, able to do, I'm still young enough to where I can do a lot of it myself. I know that won't always be the case, but for as long as I can, I mean, I like being, I think that's where you get better is, in the details. There's lots of good, thoughtful people making wine in Oregon right now, and I think the more detail-oriented you can get, the better. So I do tend to look for that in other people. There is something to be said for youthful enthusiasm. I had 2 fantastic interns in 2020, a vintage where it was really hard to feel enthusiastic about pretty much anything. And they were still so into it. and it was heartening to be around. That they were still really excited and engaged, and I think being around that, at least for me, has always made me feel more that way. The longer you are involved in any sort of discipline or job, I think your chances of getting sort of cynical about it just increase every year you're in it. And I think having new perspectives always helps it, I hope at least, keep that sort of at bay for me for as long as it can. But usually for us, a couple of people who work for us, one just came to work in the tasting room and now has a completely different job. One came and worked harvest for me from Wisconsin, never having worked in a winery at all. And she's now probably one of the most effective employees that we have at everything. I mean, she's one of those people, she can just sort of slot in anywhere and be effective. So yeah, I mean, Pat and I, now that it's the two of us, mainly running the day-to-day parts of the business, she and we were both very much in agreement on that. When you find really good people, let's just hire them, and we'll figure out what they're going to do. We'll figure that part out later. And we're trying to sort of diversify. With the purchase of Lumen came a greenhouse, and we were sort of staring at it like, well, we're not going to tear it down, so what can we do? And I have a relatively new guy who works for me. He was supposed to be a harvest intern, and he sort of just has now hung around, and now he's great, and he works with me all the time. But he was like, what would you ever think about maybe doing our own grafting, like our own bench grafting? And we're sitting there staring at this greenhouse, and I was like, go for it. Let's start building our own plants. So I think you find things that are. I mean, sometimes you find a person and didn't realize you have a need to fill until you found the person to fill it. Because we've been buying plants, and we have plants all around us. We can, it's the nice thing about grapevines is all you need to get a new grapevine is a very sharp knife, and you cut it off and you put it onto some rootstock, and you have a whole new plant. You have the genetically identical thing that you just cut it off of. And until Jeff showed some interest in that, I was kind of like, yeah, let's keep buying plants. And now we have a new employee who sort of cast us off in a different direction.
So, before we talk about the future a little bit, I want to talk about the changes you've seen outside of Bethel Heights in the industry. So tell me, from kind of your earliest perceptions of the industry to now, what are the biggest changes you've seen, and what does the industry look like now to you?
Well, bigger. As I said, I mean, we were sort of isolated down here in the Eola Hills. I don't mean that to say that we were like sort of cast-offs and alienated from the rest of the industry, but I think it just wasn't around it as much. I mean, I was around this, but not around the sort of broader industry that was developing further north. But I started working in Oregon for Lynn in 1999, and obviously since then things have grown exponentially. I think there's a lot of concern, like bigger companies coming in and buying things. It was inevitable. I think I've said this to a lot of my peers and my colleagues. I mean, like, look, we're successful. Like, this worked. And I think we can't assume that we can just throw our arms around it and hold on for dear life and assume that we can keep it just the way it was. It's never going to be that way. Things change. I mean, things are dynamic. And I think we've been really fortunate that where the industry's grown with a couple of big players, those players have leaned right into all of the things that we do, like Oregon Pinot Camp or the Willamette Valley Wineries Association, the LIVE program. That they're engaging our community and not just sort of holding it at arm's length, like, no, we've been doing this for a long time, we've got it all figured out. It has not been that way. I think the collegiality of the industry still exists. I think, I can call my friends, I can call Josh Bergstrom tomorrow and say, had a bottle of your wine, it's really, really good. Tell me exactly how you made it. And he'll do it. And I would do the exact same thing. I think as long as we can hold on to that we're all still sort of pulling in the same direction. I mean, we want brand Oregon to do well. We want the Willamette Valley to do well. I mean, obviously I want all of our own little businesses to do the same, but I think it's been one of Oregon's real strengths was, this little speck on the rind of the world, this little teeny tiny industry that's dwarfed by the state to the south. In order to get people here, it was a lot of collaboration, like Oregon Pinot Camp. My aunt and David Adelsheim and some others who were like, okay, we're flying all over the country trying to tell people about Oregon wine. What if we bring them all here and let them see it and see what we're doing and get their feet on the ground and in the dirt here? I think it's still one of the most important things our industry does.
it's a lot of fun for me. I've been a part of it for a long time. In terms of steering curriculum, in terms of telling people, okay, what do we want to nail down in terms of what makes it distinctly Oregon? Like, this can't be about winemaking. This can't be about, I use barrels that are twice as big as the barrels he's using, or, oak tank, whatever. I mean, that stuff exists anywhere in the world. What makes it unique is, standing up on top of Temperance Hill and looking out at the Eola Hill, standing up, at Lynn's place, Lynn Pennerash's place and sort of gazing out almost the entire valley and seeing how things are different. Scott Neal from Corte Terra takes people up in an airplane and flies over all the different AVAs. It's really cool, and I think that's the really important part that people take away when they come to visit the valley, is that it's not winemaking stuff. It's where we decided to grow the grapes, and I think what was validated by Robert Drouin long ago. It's funny, people talk about Domaine Drouin as though that's not it's a small little company. It's not. That's a global brand. But it was really important for our industry that there was some affirmation, especially from Burgundy, from outside perspective. My uncle and my dad tell a story all the time. Veronique staged here, which is one of the places she went, and apparently my dad and my uncle, it's funny, my uncle especially, it's like, he says things to me, I've known him my entire life, and he'll just cast off little things like, oh yeah, Robert Drouin, we sold them grapes. And I was like, well, I never knew that. And he's like, oh yeah. He walked right across the property. We were trying to show him all of these little different things. He walked, didn't even stop, just walked all the way across the property, walked to the southeast block, said, I'd like some of this. Turn around and walked straight back. I love that. He knew exactly what exposure he was looking for, and just went and found it. But I think, from Domaine Drouin to Jackson Family, that's the, when people talk about a changing industry, I think they always see the bigger properties, and it's like, no. The smaller ones are evolving too. We have people coming from all over the place now, planting small vineyards here with very different philosophies about how we should be growing grapes, how we should be looking at terroir, who's to say that I can't, make a cider and make Chardonnay, and maybe we put them together. Who's to say that we can't be co-fermenting Pinot Gris and Pinot Noir here in the valley? And I think a lot of the people in the industry are looking at all this stuff like head spins around. You're like, what on earth are you doing? It's like, when we're trying new stuff, because we're coming at it from an outside perspective, not from a fully indoctrinated, lived in Oregon your whole life kind of approach. And as a consumer, I love it. Would I do it here? No. But as somebody who likes wine and likes new ideas, I think it's tremendous. And I think the growth has to be looked at from both perspectives, in terms of bigger players coming into the valley, sure, but also the sort of evolution of small producers, small artisan producers who are looking at things in a completely new way. There's people making Nebbiolo in the Willamette Valley. I love Nebbiolo. It's one of my bad ideas for the first 50 years things that I think about putting down in Justice, we were speaking about earlier. But I don't think I'm feeling that brave to put that in the ground. You talk about the opposite end of the spectrum, but I think somebody's doing it, and I think I love it. I want to see it.
So you brought up 2020 a little bit earlier, but I want to talk about 2020 a little bit. Everybody's favorite topic to talk about.
Sure.
Talk about the pandemic first and foremost. Tell us about sort of the impact / initial reaction here, and how you had to adjust to handle it in the last year, and kind of what you see going forward for yourself coming out of it.
Yeah, it's funny when everything happened. Sounds so ominous. So I was in New York in January when there'd first been word of it happening. I was in Miami in February. I was in Texas when all flights, because that's usually the time that I can travel, is right after harvest, when the wines are sitting in barrel, and that's all they need to be doing right now. So I was sort of out in the world and getting more perspective, and I'm glad I got that, because when I came here, we're in a little, we're sitting in my aunt's porch. My mother lives about 100 yards over there. I live like 15 minutes away. You're in your own little bubble, and it all, if you turn on the news, yeah, everything looks dire, but if you decide not to do that, it's not that we have, 9 employees. We have our own crew, but they work outside. It seemed it was surreal. I mean, I think a lot of people probably used that word for you, and that's exactly what it was, because you turn on the news and watch the whole world falling apart, and then I drive to work the next day, and my day is exactly the same as it was a year before, almost entirely unchanged. Harvest was tricky because then we were bringing in people from other places. Most of our employees are are homebodies, married, don't really go and do things, or maybe an odd vacation here and there. But so I felt pretty solid. I mean, frankly, it was it's more my aunt and my uncle and my mother that I was worried about, because they were like, I think this is all a little overblown. I'm like, just please put your mask on and let's all stay away from each other and do our best here. And then harvest rolled around, and we had 2 interns, one of whom sort of blurted out they went on an internet date like in September, and I was like, oh, you guys, just like I don't want to tell you what to do, but let's try to be a little bit safe, because if we get shut, I mean, we get to do this once. I mean, once a year, and if we all get COVID, or one of us does, and we have to do contract, and staying home, I mean, what are we going to do? And they were great. We were fine. So I mean, it was hard for our business just because we are about 50-50 direct and wholesale. I mean, I think some of that's just being an established brand, that sales were so hard early on, just getting anybody to come down and taste the wine. On the side of the winery, what's now the warehouse, it used to be the exterior wall to Bethel Heights. There's this weird little red phone that's hanging like 16 feet up on the wall. Well, that used to be, what's now my office, used to be the tasting room, and there was a set of stairs that led up to this weird little red phone that alternately rang one of the 2 houses. So if you wanted to taste wine, you just picked up the phone, and it called either my parents' house or Ted and Pat's house, and they would go down and do the tasting. I mean, it was that infrequent they were seeing people. They thought, oh, what if we just install a phone here? It was ridiculous. And that phone's still there to this day. I wonder, I've never picked it up, but I kind of wonder if it would actually call Pat's house or not. Anyway, but I mean, I think because of that, there was so much more done in the wholesale market. Mm-hmm. That, I mean, did they have big ambitions that we would sell our wine in Nebraska? No, probably not. But when somebody from Nebraska called and said, hey, I'd be interested in representing Bethel Heights, it was like, oh, please, yes. Mm. And so we have a pretty deep wholesale portfolio. I think it's why people think that we make a lot more wine than we do. We only make about 10 to 12,000 cases of wine, but we're in 37 markets. Mm-hmm. And I think at least early that was out of necessity. And I think for 2020, it really helped. Because we, like a lot of other wineries, we got a lot of DTC loyalty, love early on, and we were very, very thankful for that. But wholesale didn't completely fall apart for us. One could debate whether it was states that maybe weren't taking things seriously enough. Florida, we had the best year we'd probably ever had. But I think we had diversified things enough to where it wasn't the huge financial crisis that I think we had expected it to be. We kept everybody employed. We had 2 of our employees furloughed because they wanted to. Probably because my uncle walked in and like sneezed in their office or something like that one day. But they're financially well off. They're just like, I think we're going to take a couple months off. And we're like, whatever you're comfortable with, you have a place whenever you want to come back. So it was hard, and just it disrupted our lives like it disrupted everybody else's. But again, I think because we are sort of isolated out here, you could sort of disengage from it if you needed to. I guess I was one of those people. It's like watching the car wreck. I just turn on CNN and just watch on in horror for a couple of hours. Whereas I talk to Pat the next morning. She's like, I haven't turned on the news in weeks. Don't want to do it. And I thought that COVID would have been the story of Harvest 2020, and then lo and behold, the skies turned dark, and we had sort of our first big fire event we'd ever had. In 2017, obviously California was having a horrible experience with wildfires. The Gorge also was having it. We had sort of high atmosphere smoke here, which made me a little nervous, but it more just made it sort of an unfortunate, summer to be a human being. It was hot. It was kind of smoky. It didn't smell like smoke because it was also high, and we ended up being fine. Whereas 2020, was by comparison like apocalyptic. I mean, it was the skies turned dark. You could see the fires in the evenings. It really wasn't even a thought in my mind that we weren't going to have harvest. I mean, we employ our own crew. We would have been affecting a lot of people's lives had we decided not to pick grapes, and we Some of these guys have worked for us since the 80s. And maybe I was, either naive or arrogant enough to assume that I could somehow solve the problem. I mean, I had all sorts of ideas. I was like, well, it's these compounds are phenols. You can oxidize phenols. So let's give everything. I had all sorts of ideas. I mean, I could fill half a notebook with all of my bad ideas from 2020. But we did it. And then, obviously under very different circumstances than I think a lot of us would have liked. But, I think every vintage has an identity. And I think, you need to embrace the ones that you like and the ones that you wish you had never met. I mean, I think it's a part of farming. It's a reality that I think our industry needs to embrace. And sometimes being shocked into it is better than being sort of menaced from afar, but never actually being attacked. Which is kind of what 2017 was. I mean, it was kind of like, ooh, this might be a problem, but it all worked out really well in the end. 2020 was a different story. And I'm just speaking for us. I'm not speaking for the entire industry at large. I think I've tasted with a lot of my friends. I think some very good wine will be made from the 2020 vintage. It's just from my perspective. The reason we're not tasting in the barrel cellar right now is that a lot of our 2020 is going to become somebody else's opportunity as opposed to ours.
So looking ahead for Bethel Heights, obviously you talked already about the complication of being a generational business and of having to look ahead, short-term, medium-term, long-term, and extra long-term. What are you seeing as you look ahead for the business, and what are kind of the plans you have undertaking as we come out of the pandemic and for the future of the business?
Well, it's something we wrestle with now. I mean, phylloxera is it's been a reality here since I started working here. I mean, my Uncle Ted and I talked when I first started here in 2005, and it was just sort of, it was just a loose plan about like, okay, what's 5 years and 10 years out look like? And we had sort of thought that 10 years out, we would have replanted all of the old vines by now. And here we are 15 years later, and we've barely taken anything out of the ground. But the question is now that we are staring at a dead plant next to two healthy plants, do we tear the whole block out and just replant it, change the spacing, change the trellis system, modernize things a little bit? Or do we take one dead one out and put two baby ones in its place, marrying ourselves to 10 feet in between the rows, 8 feet between plants becoming 4 feet, 540 vines per acre become, close to 1,000. And, I think for the first generation, for my parents and my aunt and my uncle, I mean, they don't want to see wholesale rip it out of the ground and replant it. And a part of me doesn't really want to see that either, because it'll be 20 years before the thing is probably recognizable to me again. So we're doing what I always swore we wouldn't do, which is taking many different approaches. We are doing some of that where we're actually just replacing, plants that have died and maintaining row spacings. We've done a little bit of just wholesale, take the entire thing out and replant it with a slightly tighter spacing. One of the ways we're fortunate is that, Ted used justice as sort of the genesis of what he'd learned farming Bethel Heights for 20 years. Our neighbor's property that we bought is planted at almost 2,400 vines per acre. I mean, it's a density that I don't think anybody here would have agreed to. I'm not even sure if I would have agreed to that, but yet now we have it. And we can see that the results are good. Better than what we have here? No, not necessarily, but it just goes to show there's so many different ways that things can be done. And we now have access to all of it. I think for our business, we ended up needing to focus a little bit on Pinot and Chardonnay, and I think that was a good thing. I had run completely amok wanting to make every white variety that I like to drink. I mean, I drink a lot of white wine at home, mainly because I taste a lot of red wine for my job. And I love Gewürztraminer, and I love Gruner, and I love Riesling, and I wanted to make all of them, and I did. And what ended up happening is we'd get a lot of referrals from other wineries, like, oh, you should go to Bethel Heights, they make really good white wine. And I realized the monster that I'd created, that 80% of what we made was still red. And so, unfortunately, the entire G section of the alphabet was canceled in one fell swoop, and we stopped making Riesling and sort of focused in. We grafted the Pinot Gris over to Pinot Noir, and so we make mainly two things now. And I think for our business right now, that's been a really positive thing.
because you don't want things to become a distraction. I mean, it's especially out in the wholesale market, it's really easy for somebody to sort of glom onto the goofball thing you make 200 cases of. We ran into that at Gruner in New York with our old brand manager. He's like, yeah, Ben, you make Gruner and that's great. Nobody cares. He's like, that wave has washed through New York, and it may just be hitting the West Coast right now, but nobody cares. And I was like, okay, fine. We only made 200 cases. He's like, oh, you only made 200 cases of it? Okay, we'll take all of that. And it became a giant distraction from selling the other stuff that we make. And so it's I would love to sort of separate the question about planting something for its own sake and completely remove the business side of it. It's a hard thing to do because things inevitably become distracting. I mean, it's going to happen. It's going to happen whether I like it or not. But I think, all of us are in agreement that I think we need to at least start in some small way looking beyond, the sort of frontier of Pinot Noir and Chardonnay, and there's nothing beyond. I think that frontier has come and gone, and we need to now be looking at the next one, which is both. It's a bittersweet thing. It's poignant. I mean, it sort of tells us at a moment in time that all of this may be becoming maybe not the right place for the varieties that we have planted, but then there's the opportunity on the other side of that for new stuff. And so it's very conflicting in terms of emotions, but it's, as with anything, I think it's important to sort of embrace it as opposed to just pretend like it's not happening. So, new varieties are certainly within the conversation. Generation 3 is not really old enough to where we need to start figuring out who has ambitions and who doesn't. We can avoid, at least for a little while, the awkward conversations that our shareholders used to be 4 or 5 people. Now they're about to be 10. And that number is only going to continue to grow, and all the uncomfortable questions that swirl around that. We've actually been having them, but it's we've at least been doing it sort of baby steps. We now, if we planted everything that we should that we can responsibly plant and not go cutting down big swaths of trees, we'll top out at about 100 acres, and I'm quite content with that. Content isn't even really the right word. I'm very thankful for that. That what looked like a terrible idea that my parents and my aunt and my uncle sort of jumped off into in the 70s, having gone to school forever and deciding that what they really liked in theory they didn't like very much in practice, and took a complete left turn, bringing the home life and the work life together, which is usually what everybody's trying to avoid. And here we are. No, I mean, I feel very, very lucky and very thankful to be in the position that I am, and that we all still get along with each other, and we all still have managed to make it work, through all this time, with being, not, with it being very democratic, and not a benevolent dictatorship. I think if Pat were sitting next to me, there's probably times she wishes it was a benevolent dictatorship, and there's probably times I could say where I wish it was too. But I'm just really, really thankful that we've managed to make it work, and that we all still sort of agree on the basic tenets of growing grapes, making wine, doing good work, not inflicting harm on the planet, being thoughtful about how we do our business, and despite the fact that we live in a capitalist society, it's not I can show you my pay stub to back it up. It's not to grow the wealth of our shareholders. It's to do this the right way.
What about as you look ahead for the Oregon industry more in general? What you've mentioned the changes you've seen. What's it going to look like in the coming years as Bethel Heights is evolving? What is the industry going to look like around it?
Well, I think brand Oregon, just by virtue of a couple of the brands that have bought in, is probably going to become a more internationally present thing, just because those marketing arms now exist, which I think in the short term will probably help the companies that have those marketing arms. But I think as there's more exposure, it can't help but help the industry at large. We don't make very much wine, but it's always one of those things like, well, a lot of these Burgundians don't make very much wine either. And yet you can find, if you were walking to one of their label rooms, it's, just keeping all that organized, like, yeah, this is the label for this one wine, but there's 15 of them because they're going to 15 different countries that all have different labeling laws. I mean, I think that's probably coming. As I mentioned, I think there will be, just more diversity in terms of things that are planted. I'm so glad that sparkling wine is becoming a thing in Oregon. I'm really glad it's not my thing. I'm glad my friends are making it so I can enjoy theirs. But I just the range of wines that are starting to come out. I mean, it creates a lot of consternation just because a lot of the marketing forever in Oregon has been, no, we are Pinot Noir. This is what we do. But there's now enough happening around the edges to where I think we can maybe be more than that. We can, our identity isn't tied to a variety. It was. But moving into the future, there will be increasing questions about whether it should be, or about whether just the place is the important thing. And what we've decided to put there isn't completely secondary, but it's still not, it's not the first thing we should be talking about. I mean, I think things can't help but get more competitive as more and more people are sort of scrambling for shelf space and consumers' attention. I think social media has probably made things more a cult of personality than I would. I mean, I'm not going to tell anybody what to do. I'm not on any social media, so I'm thankfully, blissfully unaware of all of it. But it's been a really important thing for me here in our little generational business to not make it about me, to not make it about any one person, to make it about the place. And I hope as an industry at large, we don't lose sight of that and it doesn't become, the wines are really, really good because so-and-so is there making them, because at some point that won't be true. And a few of the older brands have sold off to other people, and I completely understand that. I think it's good for them and good for the growth of our industry. I would still really like to see hopefully a couple sort of anchor on to just a line of succession and see how that moves forward. But no, I think the future is very bright. I mean, I think it took us a long time to sort of tell the world that we were making special Pinot Noir here in Oregon. I think it's going to take at least that much time, if not more, to tell people we're making special Chardonnays in Oregon, and then everything else that's going to come behind. I think the sort of ship has sailed in so many directions. It sort of feels like we've been everywhere, but I think we're realizing that no, there is still more territory to explore. More varieties, more ways to engage both sort of, the wine buyer who found the wine they like 30 years ago and that's the one they like and that's the one they keep buying, and the people who like a little bit of everything as long as it's under $12 on a list and I can't pronounce it, but I don't care, I'll try that one. No, I'm excited, and I think, I have tried to get, I sort of reluctantly did it. Pat, my aunt, has been involved in like every committee you can be on in Oregon at one point or another. She's been on, and she started pressuring me to do more of that, and I was like, no, I don't want to. I don't want to get into that. It feels almost like politics. It's too, I don't have constituents. I don't want to just go there and start shooting my mouth off about the way that I think we should be doing things, because I'm not necessarily right. I have an idea about what I want, but this is for the broader audience. And what she said to me is, she's like, Ben, if we just put people on panels who wanted to be on panels, our industry could start moving in one direction very, very quickly. It's the idea, you sort of build the Platonic, you build the walls of the Republic and you keep it, keep the vision here and ignore what's happening outside. She's like, it can't be that way. It can't be the same people on everything. And your reluctance to do so means you don't have an agenda, and good. Little does she know we all kind of quietly have agendas, but I've been engaged in a lot of programs with my colleagues and peers in the industry, and it makes me really proud to be a part of it, because we all come at it from a slightly different way. And do we all agree with each other all the time? Absolutely not. But their perspective is always, it always feels like it comes from a good place. Not just about the protection of their business, but also like, we bought all this land, but we're not going to, we're not going to just keep growing and growing and growing for growth's sake. At some point, this is enough. I have enough. And I think most of the industry still sort of feels that way. And I think being on a lot of panels, it's just nice having that sort of positive reinforcement. I mean, I mentioned sort of youthful enthusiasm. I think, sitting around the table with, thoughtful people of all ages who, are all sort of thinking about this, both in the same way and from different perspectives is it's neat, and it makes me very happy to be a part of it.
All right. Last question for you. We're going to get a little philosophical to end this.
Okay.
What is the role of wine in society?
I mean, I think we've talked about this a little bit before. I mean, I think, the nice thing about wine is it sort of invites discussion about place and procedure and grapes and where you grow them and why that's important and how they're grown. It sort of invites intellectual curiosity. I mean, it's funny you use the word civilization. I mean, what was it, Oscar Wilde who quipped that, the United States went from barbarism to decadence and skipped civilization in the middle, being such a young country. I mean, you could almost argue our industry sort of started the same way. It was it wasn't all for one right in the beginning. It became that way, but it didn't all start that way. So, I mean, I think, questions about the planet and our responsibility to it, being the entities that have the most ability to rapidly change it, is important. And I think anything that can be done to engage that question, whether it's cold hard statistics, sort of jarring events that are happening around the country at sort of increasing rates. If we can have that conversation with wine about farming, about how we engage in agriculture, how we feed our country, how we feed the planet, how we provide, the basic elements of survival of, shelter, water, sustenance, and do it in a way that we can keep doing it for a long, long time. Anything that I think can bring that topic to the table is important, and I think wine is uniquely situated to do that. I mean, you can't have that conversation over a steak because you're immediately going to start feeling bad about eating the steak you are eating. You can't have that conversation over seafood because you're going to almost immediately start feeling bad about the seafood you're eating. Even plant-based diets. I mean, there's, as I mentioned before, it's all the little unintended consequences when you start changing things rapidly. But I think wine provides a great context to start having those conversations because, while growing grapes isn't easy, it's fairly benign in terms of its impact on the environment, assuming you're doing things the right way. I feel bad for saying that immediately. Assuming you're doing them in a certain way. And I think anything that can push that conversation forward, as I said before, if you and I were sitting here eating a sandwich and musing over wheat and where it was grown and how it was farmed, it wouldn't be a very interesting conversation. Wine, I think, lends itself more to digging a little bit deeper into the topic. And I think that's important, especially with sort of divisive opinions about the role of science in civilization. I think anything that can get us to the table and talking is important. And, wine growing up for me was a center part of the table. It still is in my life today. And I think it can be that bridge, or at least I hope it can.
All the questions that I have for you, Ben. Is there anything I didn't ask that I should have? Anything we didn't cover here today that we should have covered?
No, I don't think so. I think we did what we came here to do.
I would agree with that. Thank you so much for your time,
My
for
pleasure.
your stories and your hospitality here, and we'll go ahead and let you off the hook.
All right, thank you very much.
Thank you.